You're wearing clothes right now. You put them on this morning, probably without much thought. Shirt, pants, maybe a jacket. You grabbed what was clean or what seemed right for the weather or what matched, and then you walked out the door. But here is something worth pausing on. Every other great ape on Earth gets up in the morning and does not do that. Chimpanzees don't, gorillas don't, bonobos don't, and for most of evolutionary history, neither did we. So what changed? If you ask most people why humans wear clothes, you'll get one of three answers: warmth, modesty, protection. And none of those answers are wrong exactly. They just aren't the whole story. Because when you look at the actual evidence, the biology, the archaeology, the parasite record, the reason humans started wearing clothes turns out to be stranger and older than most people realize. And the best witness to when it happened isn't a tool, or a fossil, or an ancient piece of fabric. It's a louse. Let's start with warmth. It's a reasonable guess. Humans live in cold climates. Clothing clearly helps with that. But here's the problem. Lots of animals live in cold climates without clothing. Wolves, bears, horses, mountain goats, none of them make jackets. They're covered in fur instead. And for most of our evolutionary history, humans were too. Not as much as a bear, but significantly more than we are now. If cold drove the origin of clothing, we'd expect the story to begin with ancient humans moving into cold environments and reaching for animal skins to compensate. But the timeline is harder to read than that, because the problem actually starts much earlier, with why humans lost their fur in the first place. Then there's modesty. This one sounds intuitive, but it's doing something quietly strange. It's projecting a modern social idea backward into a past that didn't have those categories yet. There's no evidence that ancient humans who weren't wearing clothes were experiencing shame in the way we understand it. Modesty as a clothing explanation is modern culture reading itself into deep time. The real question, the one that's harder to answer, is why humans needed clothing at all. Look at any other great ape. Chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, all of them are covered in dense body hair. Now look at a human being. We have the skin, more or less, of a nearly hairless animal. We have hair on our heads and scattered elsewhere, but compared to our closest living relatives, we are remarkably bare. This is unusual. Across mammals, dense body hair is the norm. It provides insulation, some protection from the sun, a partial barrier against insect bites. Losing it is not a small change, so why did it happen? The most widely supported explanation involves movement and heat. As early humans began spending more time in open grassland environments, they needed to cover long distances. Hunting, foraging, tracking, sustained effort in full sunlight generates enormous amounts of body heat. Dense fur traps that heat. For an animal resting in shade for most of the day, that's useful. For an animal moving for hours across open ground in direct sun, it becomes a serious problem. Overheating can kill. Here's where something unusual about human skin becomes important. Humans have eccrine sweat glands, the sweat glands used specifically for cooling, distributed across almost the entire body surface. Most other primates have them primarily on the palms and feet. Humans have them nearly everywhere. This gave early humans one of the most effective heat dissipation systems in the animal kingdom, the ability to cool through evaporation at a rate few other large animals can match. But that system works best on bare skin. Dense fur reduces its efficiency significantly. One way to think about human hair loss is this. At some point in our evolutionary past, the advantage of being able to move, hunt, and travel for long distances in heat outweighed the cost of shedding the fur. The cooling system was already there. Losing the insulation allowed it to work properly. That left something exposed, though, not just to UV radiation and night cold, but to the attention of external parasites. Lice, ticks, and fleas build up quickly in dense fur. A body that sheds most of its fur removes much of that habitat, which matters for what comes next. At this point, we've arrived at a genuinely strange gap in the record. Humans lost most of their body hair long before any clear evidence of clothing appears archaeologically. So there's a period, possibly a very long one, between a bare-skinned human and a clothed one. and closing that gap is difficult because clothing almost never survives. Fabric rots, processed animal skins decay, even in excellent preservation conditions, organic material disappears over long timescales. What gets left behind is stone, bone, and occasionally the marks that tools leave on other things. The garments themselves vanish. But there is one witness to this period that researchers have found unexpectedly useful, and it is not something you would expect to find in an archaeology paper. It's a louse, specifically the body louse, a close relative of the head louse. The two are varieties of the same species, and they look almost identical, but they live in completely different places. Head lice live in scalp hair, body lice live in clothing and bedding. They only move to the human body surface to feed. This distinction is the key to everything. Body lice cannot live on bare skin alone. They lay their eggs in the seams of fabric. Without clothing or bedding, body lice as we know them could not exist, which means, logically, that body lice appeared after clothing appeared. The moment you have body lice in the fossil record, or rather, in their genetics, clothing must already have existed. Researchers have used the genetic differences between body lice and head lice to estimate when the two varieties diverged from each other. The reasoning goes like this. When humans started wearing clothing regularly, some head lice moved into that new habitat. Over generations, the two populations became distinct. The farther back that split happened, the farther back clothing goes. Estimates from different studies vary, and it's worth being honest that the molecular clock methods used here are not perfectly precise instruments. Results across studies have produced a range rather than a single agreed date. But the consistent finding points to clothing use beginning well before the oldest sewing tools we've recovered, likely in the range of tens of thousands of years before those tools appear. Some estimates reach further back still. The point is not a single confirmed number. The point is the logic of the evidence itself. A parasite that cannot survive without clothing only exists if clothing already exists. Body lice are, in a strange sense, a biological receipt, a record kept in the genome of a tiny creature that moved into a new niche the moment humans created one. It is one of the stranger pieces of evidence in all of human prehistory. The archaeological record, as usual, is fragmentary. What survives from the ancient world is mostly stone and bone. Organic material disappears, especially in wet or variable climates. Even if early humans were wrapping themselves in animal skins far earlier than our oldest clear evidence, we would have very little physical trace of it. What we do find are tools that imply the behavior. Scrapers and awls, tools used for cleaning, softening, and perforating animal hides, appear at multiple sites across different regions and time periods, where patterns on some scrapers are consistent with hide working. In certain cases, the residues on bone tools and the condition of animal remains at occupation sites point toward the systematic processing of skins. Among the oldest known sewing tools recovered to date is a bone needle from Denisova Cave in Siberia, associated with deposits estimated at around 50,000 years old. It is small, carefully shaped, and functional, evidence that by that point at least someone had mastered the technique of stitching material together. But the oldest known example of something is not the same as the first time it happened. It is the oldest example that survived long enough to be found and dated. The behavior almost certainly predates the oldest tool that left a recoverable trace. This is a useful thing to remember about the archaeological record in general. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially for organic materials across deep time. One question this raises is whether clothing was a uniquely modern human development, or whether it emerged earlier and across more than one human lineage. Neanderthals lived across Europe and parts of Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, including through periods of intense cold. The question of whether they wore clothing has been examined through indirect evidence. The tools they made, the animals they hunted, and what those animals might have been used for beyond food. Archaeological evidence suggests Neanderthals were processing animal hides. Scrapers found at Neanderthal sites show wear patterns consistent with hide working. The large animals they regularly hunted would have provided material that could serve as covering. Some researchers have also pointed to associations between Neanderthal remains and the feathers of certain large birds as possible evidence of symbolic use of materials, though the interpretation of these findings remains genuinely ongoing. What the evidence allows us to say carefully is this: Neanderthals likely covered themselves in some form. Whether this developed independently from what early modern humans were doing, whether it involved knowledge that moved between groups, is less clear. Clothing may not have been invented once by one group and then spread outward. It may have been something that emerged more than once from the same basic situation, a bare-skinned primate in a variable climate, solving the same problem. There's one more layer worth holding before we close. We tend to picture ancient clothing as purely functional. Cold outside, animal skin helps, problem solved. But the evidence doesn't entirely support a clean line between practical and symbolic. The oldest known ornaments and the oldest clear evidence of hide working appear in overlapping time periods. Beads, pigments, and modified shells, objects that carry apparent social meaning without an obvious survival function, show up alongside evidence of increasingly sophisticated material processing. The suggestion in the record is that once humans were making coverings, meaning was already gathering around them. Some researchers argue the transition from functional to symbolic may have been almost immediate, that clothing became a social signal, a marker of identity or group membership very quickly after it began. We cannot know exactly when that crossing happened or whether it ever wasn't happening, but the implication is that what you wear has never been purely about temperature. That may have been true from the very beginning. You're still wearing clothes. Whatever fabric is against your skin right now is descended from a technology that early humans were using long before agriculture, long before cities, long before writing. The specific moment it began is harder to recover than most people assume. Clothing rots. Ancient skin doesn't survive. The organic record is mostly gone. But the evidence that remains: a bare-skinned body that needed covering, a parasite that could only exist once that covering existed, and tools that show the knowledge being carried forward, points toward a practice that is genuinely ancient and far less simple than it first appears. The louse record suggests it was happening well before the oldest needles we've found. The oldest needles suggest sophisticated construction by at least 50,000 years ago. The biology of the body suggests a need that existed long before either of those things. Somewhere in that gap, an early human wrapped something around themselves and kept the habit. We don't know exactly when. We don't know what it felt like. But the practice they started has never stopped. Every piece of clothing you own is one of the oldest human technologies still touching your skin every day. Most of it is newer than agriculture. None of what it's doing is as simple as it looks. What ordinary human habit should we trace back next? Leave it in the comments.